Welcome to Charting New Paths in Pre-K to 12 Education, a podcast by Solution Tree. We'll highlight the triumphs of top pre-K to 12 education leaders as they share their journey from previous challenges to their current course of action. Hear encouraging success stories from school and district leaders, teachers, and the education experts we're pleased to call our authors and associates. As their stories unfold, discover how these purpose-filled educators work collaboratively to create high levels of learning for all their students. I'm your host, Prisma Lopez-Marin. Enjoy today's episode. Hello, everyone. This is a special edition podcast episode as we'll be talking with the education leaders, past and present, from the Adlai E Stevenson High School District 125 in Lincolnshire, Illinois. They will share with us their experience with the Solution Tree, the impact of professional learning communities at work, and their success story in becoming a model PLC district. You will also gain some understanding of what it takes to sustain the PLC process from the very school and district that started it all. With us today from Adlai E Stevenson High School District is the current superintendent, Twadell, and the school's principal, Troy Gobble, joined by the district's former superintendent and our esteemed Solution Tree author and associate, Tim Kanold. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for this episode.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you.
Yeah, we're glad to be here.
No, this is such an honor to be able to interview such legends and then also the current leadership. So I appreciate your time for being here. Let's go ahead and dive in to these questions here. Now, just so that we could get to know you more, the listeners as well, can you all share with us your history and current experience with serving the Adlai E Stevenson High School District as education leaders?
Well, I guess I'll go first as the oldest member of our team here today. So my name's Tim Kanold, and I got to Stevenson. I came to Stevenson in 1986, 87 school year. And
that's when I graduated from high school, by the way.
So there you go. That gives you the idea. And the principal was Rick DuFour. And so I came as the director of mathematics and science. My responsibility was to teach mathematics and also direct those two divisions of the school. And I did that for 22 years before I became an assistant superintendent in the district and eventually the superintendent following Rick DuFour.
All right. And my name again is Twadell, and I'm currently the superintendent here at Stevenson. And my first year here at Stevenson was in 1994, so a few years after Tim. And I began as a social studies teacher teaching world history and American government. And then in 1999, I became a curriculum director in social studies. And in 2006 and 7, assistant superintendent. And then when Tim retired, superintendent in 2007. So I've been the superintendent now for about 15 years. Feels like 30, but I think it's 15. So
incredible.
The last 2 years have kind of doubled the effect. So yeah.
It looks like it's been 30 in the pictures from
I know.
Yeah, it's I can tell.
I think of the pandemic years as dog years. So everything.
That's kind of the way it went.
Yeah.
So my name is Troy Gobble, and I'm the principal here at Stevenson. And I've been here since 2010. So before that, I was a science teacher, mostly physics, for about 18 years, and also a department chair for a science department, not at Stevenson. And in my role here, I've been both assistant principal and principal. Principal now. This is finished my 10th year.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is.
10 years.
You all come from different abilities or different topics of what you covered as educators. So fast forward to now into your leadership role. That's very interesting. All right. So Mr. Kanold, tell us more about how the PLC at Work movement began under Mr. Richard DuFour's leadership.
Well, sure. So, I first met a lot of those on the podcast may or may not know that Rick DuFour, Dr. Richard DuFour, and Dr. Robert Aker were the original architects of what we now know today as the PLC at Work process. But of course, back in now 40 years ago, in 1980, there was no such thing. We didn't even have the internet. There was no concept of this idea of teachers coming together, working together with administrators to really impact student learning in a meaningful way through a collaborative process around results. That didn't even exist back then. So I met Rick because I became a math teacher, and I was in a neighboring school district called West Chicago Community High School District 94. And that was in 1980. And then Rick left in 83 to become the principal of Adlai Stevenson High School, which is the high school in the district, Adlai Stevenson High School District 125. And at the time, there was a lot of controversy in that district for lots of reasons. The principal had just didn't resign, just left and didn't tell anyone, and never came back in the spring of 86 or 83. And then
you do that?
What's that? Sorry? Yeah, he literally got on his motorcycle, left the building in February of 1983, and never returned. Didn't tell anyone, didn't let anyone know. He just, and actually people were sort of wondering, well, when's our principal coming back? So it was that spring that the current superintendent at the time, a gentleman by the name of Dr. Mick Herzog, hired Rick away from where I was working in West Chicago and said, hey, we want you to come to our school district and get us turned around, begin to get us, towards becoming an excellent school. And that was when Rick began, I think, the early stages of thinking through what would it look like to become what we now call today a professional learning community. In 1986, I interviewed and became part of his team by becoming the director. At the time, it was called the director of the Mathematics and Science Division, which meant really that I was working directly for Rick as part of what we would call today his guiding coalition. But we didn't have those words or phrases back then. We didn't call it that. We were like just a whole bunch of people coming together to try to get things to get better. That would have been the name of our group. But one of the things that was revealed by 1990 was that we were not, the first big idea that most people listening to this podcast might know is that we are supposed to be about learning. And so I think most of us thought, well, our jobs were to teach. And that idea of crossing over being about student learning was new. And in 1990, Rick presented us, our guiding coalition team, what you would call that today, with a book by Peter Senge called The Fifth Discipline, and what's true about really highly effective organizations. And what Rick's point he wanted to impress on us is that they were becoming learning organizations, which meant the adults learned and the students would be learning, and that that our work effort would be focused on having a high impact on student learning. And if we couldn't provide evidence of that, then what are we doing to change and I see Eric kind of nodding his head as I'm mentioning this, and I'm really anxious to hear about his role when he came in 94, because when Rick delivered that to us, Rick was a social studies guy. So I think he kind of sort of had in his mind what that might look like in that discipline and perhaps in the liberal arts in general. Whereas I was a math science person, more, kind of like Troy, and everything was a little bit more linear for me. And yet I also saw the great need for us to do that in that area as well. So our guiding coalition became focused on those things as early as 1990. And so it's really in the 90s that the idea in our school district, which is really the origin district of the entire PLC movement that we're all trying hard to pursue well today, began. And Robert Aker from the University of Tennessee came in and kind of helped guide us through some of these principles. Rick knew Bob from some work we were doing with Jerry Bellin down at the University of Tennessee on teacher evaluation. And Rick and Bob started to use us as sort of guinea pigs. We were like trying to experiment with some of these things of collaborating around results, et cetera, during the 90s. And it resulted in their book in 1998 called Professional Learning Communities at Work. And that idea, those three words were really important. Not amateur learning communities, professional. How do professionals come to work and behave? And then how do they come to work and learn from one another in order to raise their own knowledge base and work and effort with students? And then how do they work in community? And there are some great stories I could tell you about the beginning days that led up to that. One just real quick one was in 1998 when that book came out. A teacher comes running into my office during what was our collaboration time, where teachers come together before school to collaborate around the work they're doing in a particular unit of study. A biology teacher comes running in my room and says, "Tim, come quick. I think I'm going to change your name because I don't want to, since this isn't a podcast. I think Maureen is dying. Come quick." And they were meeting in a biology lab. So I go running down to the lab, and there she is laying on the floor with blood flowing out of her face. And so I'd had the bloodborne pathogen training, but I didn't really think much about it. I just jumped on top of this woman, put my hands on top of her face in order to keep the blood from coming out of her eye socket until the paramedics could get there. And she ended up at the hospital, 17 stitches. And that part, the aftermath of all that's a long story. But I met with the team and thinking, like, as administrator, maybe I should be sitting in on this team meeting. I just thought people would collaborate nicely with one another. It didn't occur to me that maybe I have to teach them how to be in healthy relationships with one another. And so I asked the team, well, what the heck happened? And it turned out they were, believe it or not, they were trying to get agreement on the common homework that would be assigned during this unit, because we felt it was a rigor issue in biology. Like if some kids got homework that had not a lot of cognitive depth to it, then that wouldn't be fair to the kids who did. And they're all going on in our science sequence. So the team would work hard to decide what was but it's their decision to make that. And to decide what's the rigor they want to teach with. And they got into an argument, and one of the teachers on the team who did not want to assign certain homework problems took her biology book and threw it at the teacher across the table and knocked her out of the chair 19 stitches later. So I want to tell you, the ride wasn't smooth. And that's just a really simple example of, a bump in the road. But Eric, I'd really be interested in hearing, what you think about, because I was in math and science, and kind of in some ways we operated in our own silos. And if knowing now what I know, that you came on board in '94, from both a teacher and curriculum director point of view, and eventually becoming part of the team, like what was it like for you? Were there any bumps in the road, even in the collaborative process in social studies?
Well, there were. Whatever bumps in the road that we had, though, I think pale in comparison to textbooks being flown across the room there in the science department. So you guys really.
It's a projectile problem, and that's what we do. We do a lot of those in class. So, collisions, it fits right in with how we work.
Right. Yeah. We prefer to talk out our problems, but I think, that's really interesting, Tim. I started at Stevenson in '94 as a teacher and became a curriculum director in '99. And I think my experience, is similar in that, as a teacher, I think there was this understanding that things were starting to happen a little bit differently. And I'm not sure that I would, if I remember back, I don't know that at the time I would have said that, well, we're going to focus on learning rather than teaching as our fundamental purpose, which we all understand now very well as a, driver and big idea of schools as PLCs. At the time, I think it was really about creating a culture of high expectations, and that we wanted all kids to achieve at the highest levels possible for them. So in social studies, for example, we really kind of led the way in the school toward getting all kids participating in our advanced placement program. So by the end of the decade, we had more kids taking AP and writing AP exams than all other departments combined. And that was something that we felt like, really was a feather in our cap, trying to help support the school-wide mission of learning, but within social studies of creating a culture of high expectations for all kids. And what's interesting about that, and this is only in retrospect, of course, but in my mind, that's really where the second and third big idea of schools as professional learning communities came from, because as we were encouraging and supporting more kids into those AP classes, we realized that we needed to collaborate more effectively on vertical curriculum, moving kids from world history to AP European history to US history to AP US history, et cetera. And the only way we could do that is if we collaborate more effectively. And then when some kids maybe were not being as successful as they could be, then we really had to focus on that third big idea around results, measuring them, identifying what supports they need, interventions, et cetera. So I really do think that late 90s, early 2000s was a pivotal time in that growth as a professional learning community and really framing out those 3 big ideas. So yeah, it was a very interesting time. It was fun to be a part of that ride.
So Tim,
Well,
it's interesting.
yeah, go ahead, Troy.
I've kind of crisscrossed with Stevenson early in my career. So I was in the south suburbs at Carl Sandburg High School.
Oh yeah, right.
Just as a physics teacher. And we were a very traditional school. I taught what I taught in my class, and the physics teacher down the hall taught completely different things. We never really discussed. My class was a little louder and crazier, and everybody knew that. And, it's what it was. And I remember distinctly in 99, we had bought the book right away, the PLC at work. We bought the book and we started reading it. We built some time into our schedule. And I remember we're like, okay, here we are. We're all sitting together. What are we going to do? And the first thing was, well, we're supposed to write down our curriculum. So we wrote down Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 3, Unit 4. Okay, we're done. Now what are we going to do for the rest of the year? And there was like this pause. And I remember, I think about this all the time. There was like well, what do they want us to do? Like that was the question that we started asking. I'm not even sure who mystical they was at that point, but we were just like, what do they want us to do? And, we kind of struggled and we got a lot of tasks. The folks would say like, well, now you need to make this thing. And so we would make a curriculum map. Okay, we did that. Now what, right? And my principal at the time, his name is Jack Balderman, who you guys might know. Yeah. Jack brought us up here to meet the team. And so it was probably late 99 or early 2000 that we came to Stevenson. And it was like, it's like if somebody from the 1800s was in a New York City today, right? Like things were moving quickly. And I remember sitting and the realization that the thing that I walked away from that meeting was, it's not about these events and these things they want us to do. It's really changing the culture of the school. And that was my takeaway. We spent all day here working with different teachers and folks. And it was like, it's not just things you need to do. You have to change the way that everybody works together. And I remember that was really powerful for me. The problem was back at my school, only 6 of us came. And, it was a school with a staff of 250 teachers. We were not good enough at getting that message. It took us a while to change that thinking. So I think it was just as you were saying earlier, it was such a different idea for the way that schools worked. And I saw it play out when I went back to my school the next day. Like, this is what they're doing is very different.
That's so interesting.
I love hearing that from both of you because, for me, Rick always saw our work at Stevenson as sort of a laboratory. And he saw it as a lab. One of the things that's in the definition of the PLC process, as you both know, is this idea of collective inquiry, that you come together in order to say, well, if we try these teaching strategies, how will they work? And let's come back together and find out what does the data tell us and the results orientation. And I think that was all sort of being shaped and birthed, that culture that you saw, Troy, in 99. I'm so glad to hear you saw it. You saw that happening because that was our intent in that decade. And even thinking in my head now about that being 30 years ago is pretty daunting. But one of the things that a lot of people don't know is that when that book came out in 98, there were only 3 critical questions. There weren't 4. There were 3. It was, what do we want every child to know and be able to do? And what do we want that curriculum to be? But that's the depth of that is in unpacking those standards and what do they mean for each of us and how do we actually then teach them so that we get great results. Eric, you spoke really to something that both Rick and I just wanted to destroy as a way of life at Stevenson. I'm so glad to hear you. You spoke about access opportunity. Your area of leadership in school of the school really said, no, we're going to give kids access to our best curriculum. We talk about that at times, but delivering on that kind of access inequality that can exist was really, and it wasn't like, oh, we'll give everybody access by lowering our standards. No, we'll give everybody access by raising our standards. And that was also part of that movement. And, you know, and I even remember, Troy, it's interesting you talk about that beginning, because even when I got to Stevenson in 86, Rick's first thing he allowed me to do was take my entire math department, which at the time was 29 teachers, to a retreat and basically declare, we have no curriculum anymore. If we are going to rebuild from scratch the most essential standards there are. And I think about it now and I'm like, that was so innovative. Today, that'd be like, well, that's what you got to do. What are your essential standards that we must teach, et cetera? So, you know, all of those things built into 98, and that resulted in that book. You were seeing the residue of it when you came up to visit, which is good to hear.
Yeah.
And, you know, and then I feel like, we were the one other part of all of that Rick did a really good job is results became public. And I think that's something maybe later in this podcast, I'd like to hear the two of you talk about how you still do that. But long before the state of Illinois or states across the country really required us to have a report card and report results out, Rick was insistent that we would report all our results out to the public, in the general results, generalized results, not by teacher, but by general categories of performance by our students. And that we would set short and long-term goals. You guys will really like this, because you know our former long-term board president, who I'm not going to name in the podcast, but we had a former long-term board president. And I got called, he came to my office, kind of called me into his office, so to speak. He came to see me while I'm in my early stages of being director of math and science. And he says, you know, Tim, I just want you to show me what's this line item in your budget? And I was like, what do you mean? And he's like, you know, you're spending, now this is 1988, you're spending $3,500 on cake. And I was too young at the time to know you shouldn't call a line item exactly what it is. You should probably call it something like supplies or something. So I said, well, it's not always for cake. Sometimes it's cupcakes or donuts or fruit or other coffee, you know, other things. And he said, well, what on earth would you be spending that money for? And I said, well, because every Friday we look for something to celebrate. We look for somewhere where we made a short-term win in our district and, you know, in our school and in my particular area, math and science. And I said, and so we look for somewhere where student performance improved, and then we celebrate that group, that 2 or 3 people or whoever it might be, or 8 or 9, and we have food. So, you know, I learned that from Rick, this idea of constant celebration of short-term wins, even while you're after long-term victories. I remember when we, you know, for every, I'm always hesitant sometimes to talk about what is the long-term data. I'd love to hear how you guys feel about this, what long-term data looks like sometimes, because, you know, it's specific to the local school or the school district, what data is really important to them. But for us, because we were a high school district, and in Illinois, the test became the Prairie State exam, and the Prairie State exam was an ACT exam, we had to focus on that performance. And I remember we set this long-term goal of we were going to hit 28 as a math in the math science department, mathematics. We were going to hit a 28 on the ACT for an average score of a senior class graduating. And when we hit it, we had this huge party. I mean, huge, because it had been a 10-year labor to hit that number. And it wasn't about the number. I mean, I want people on this podcast to know, when you set achievement goals, student achievement goals, it's not about the number as much as it's about the human beings that benefit because of that number. And Rick would always say to us, well, how do you get the bottom half of your kids in to go to college? How do you get them to be able to get into a community? Well, get them a great ACT score and they can go, even though they're number, 531 in a class of 1,100 kids. So anyway, all of that was, I think, part of our goal, that both short and long-term goals played out. So, those are just thoughts that are in my head about wondering about how you guys sustained that.
Well, as you say that, the cliche comes to mind. And some cliches are cliches because they're true, right? Like rising tide lifts all ships, and I think that as we created this culture of high expectations, that just wasn't a culture of high expectations for some kids. It was a culture of high expectations for all kids. And that's something that I know Troy and I feel really strongly about. And, our mission statement since 1984 has been success for every student. And, we want every kid who's interested to be able to be ready to go to college or some other kind of post-secondary experience. And that remains the goal to this day. We continue to see, a higher and higher graduation rate. We continue to see our ACT and SAT and AP scores go up. They're not growing as fast as they used to because, you're getting closer and closer to, the highest score you can get. So the growth is slowing down. But I think we continue to see that push toward continuous improvement, and the data continues to get better. Our teachers work really hard to help each and every kid be successful. And that, that's something that Stevenson does particularly well. We're just stewards of that legacy that, Rick kind of started in the early 80s.
So because Eric's a social studies person, he's not allowed to do math or data in public. Yeah. So I'll help him out here on this one a little bit. My favorite, I've spent a lot of time with the data. My favorite point here is that this long-term data, we've had a goal here to give a college level experience to every graduating senior. That goal has been around for 20 years, probably longer. I don't actually know when it came about. And in college level experience, we mean an AP class, a dual credit class with a local college, or articulated credit through our community college locally. And when you look back so I have that data that we've been plotting. I've got 30 years of that data. And when you go back into the 90s, the number of seniors who graduated with at least one college level experience was around 30%, right? Like you would expect a good school, that's the honors program, right, in a school. And that number has gone up, and it pretty consistently gone up. And in about 2015, we crossed the 90% threshold. So 90%, just think about that number, 90% of all students who graduate from Stevenson High School leave here with at least one college level experience before they've graduated one of those courses. And now we've bopped up and around, we're in 93%, and that's sort of settled in. But a couple of things are true, right? The long slope of that, I think, is so important. It wasn't some radical, we're going to put 800 kids in this class to just jump the number. We've slowly grown because it was a goal, because we've built vertical articulation to get kids excited about that college level experience and prepared. We built a curriculum that has capstone courses in almost every area, so that there are places, if a kid finds something they're passionate about, they are able to find that class. So again, that vertical articulation you mentioned earlier is so important. And then I think something that many people would be surprised, no freshman at Stevenson High School takes an AP course. We still hold to a model that freshman year is preparing you for the background skills that you need to be successful. And we could up the number probably. We could change, if we open up the floodgates to freshmen to take those courses, there'd be hundreds of more AP tests given every year. Right. But the idea that if you're a kid here, we're talking special ed kids, any student who goes to Stevenson High School, 93% of them graduate having had a college level experience, prepared for the next level. I think that probably is the number that I'm most proud of in the time. And I think it speaks exactly, as you said, Tim, to that goal, having a long-term goal and working diligently to achieve it.
So Troy, I love what you said, and Troy's been a big part, Tim, of that growth over the last decade. And what I love what you said about that, Troy, is we've seen that growth, and we've stayed kind of true north, if you will, to that goal. If there's any cynics out there, they would say, well, you're just interested in the accolades and the scores and the ACT scores and the AP scores. And what we try to remind people is that no, we don't need any more awards. We've got plenty of awards. We don't need any more accolades. We have those too. having more kids involved in the AP program or helping students improve their ACT and SAT score helps them. You know, like the research is really clear. You know, when kids participate in an AP or college level experience while in high school, they're going to be better, if not more prepared than students who haven't when they go to college. You know, nothing magical happens, you know, the summer after senior year in June, July, and August that gets kids ready for college. That's our job. And I think we've always felt that the most productive, most effective way to get kids ready for college is to give them a college level experience while they're in high school with all the wraparound supports that we can give them, you know, that they're probably not going to get in a 300 person, you know, business 101 class at U of I, you know, but we can provide them with that experience here. So it's not just about the scores themselves. There's kids behind those data points, and the more experiences we give them in those college-like classes, the more prepared they're going to be. And one other quick thing I would say about that is what's been so interesting is having been here at Stevenson now for almost 30 years, as you've seen the data change, the community has changed as well. And that might be a different podcast altogether, but you know, the community has changed significantly as well. And the idea that, you know, this is a school of high expectations and getting kids ready for college. I mean, truly a college preparatory school that maybe it wasn't, you know, was, Tim, when you and Rick started here in the early 80s. You know, I think that was the trajectory that you guys wanted to see. Well, now it's fully baked into the expectations of the folks who literally move here just to send their kids to Stevenson.
Yeah, actually, you know, two really funny connected pieces to what you just said, Eric. It was just sort of my style. But when I got there then in 86, so by 1988, 87, 88 school year, I was sort of shocked at how bad our data was. The overall performance in mathematics and science, when you dug down into the middle school and looked at all our feeder district and their grades from grades 6 through 8, and then you looked at Stevenson High School's math and science grades, believe it or not, we had almost 69% of the kids getting D's and F's, getting really bad grades. And they weren't even in the best curriculum. So they're getting bad grades in a bad curriculum sequence in terms of the access issues you guys are talking about. For example, we had kids coming into the high school who weren't even eligible for algebra or biology yet. You know, they had to take entry courses that we would not consider to be, you know, and it was just way too many. So one thing I did was eliminate those courses. So then you had to start out, you know, in algebra or regular, what we at the time called college preparatory physical science. All of that just to say that I actually said in front of our school board, I said, look, we need to stop lying. You want to say that this is a college preparatory institution, whether it's a 4-year college or a 2-year college or even a trade school, a post-secondary. And I said, and that's just a lie. Only about half of our kids go on. Here's the data. Only half our kids actually go on to a post-secondary experience. So why are we saying we're that if we're actually not? Why don't we just declare we're that for half of your kids? And, you know, we're sorry that we can't meet those needs for the other half. And boy, did that make the newspapers. And then the second, and even then I'm thinking like, oh, I'm going to get fired. You know, what the heck? And I had told Rick that I wanted to talk about that. I didn't tell him exactly what I was going to say. And he had to talk with me the next day. And then about how to be more community savvy, because I would agree with you, you know, you are symbiotic with the community. And what a lot of people don't know is we're not, you know, the district does not serve a single community per se. It serves like 26 townships. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Something like that. Yeah. I mean,
Yeah.
It's very spread out. It was very rural and it became much more suburban over time. And then the second thing, Eric, that I also said at that time was if we just got rid of math and science, the overall GPA of the entire school district would go up immediately. And so that didn't win me a lot of friends either. But that we were sort of the keeper of the bad grades. You know, we sort of saw that as our responsibility. And if there's one thing that I think I want to say that would come out of this podcast, it's that we should not be embarrassed because kids perform really well. As educators, we are not in the selecting and sorting business. It's not that we should, in fact, we had to fight hard this idea that proficiency, which we talk about so easily today, but we didn't back then. Proficiency, like really all students should learn the standards. This is the bar and all kids should get over the bar. Really? Well, no, actually, no. Some kids don't, just can't make it, Tim. And fighting that mindset that not all kids, that in fact, that's why critical question 3 happened. Because what will be our response if kids aren't getting over the bar was we have to figure out how. Rick was really the first one I ever heard talk about, we have to give them more time then. How can we provide support for them outside of their normal mainstream experience to get them up over that bar? And so that critical question 3, really was our way of responding to this idea that all students, if we say this is the guaranteed and viable curriculum because of critical question 1, so this is the guaranteed and viable curriculum for kids in 7th grade social studies, for kids in US history, for kids in biology, for kids in sophomore English, really? Well, then doesn't that mean it's guaranteed and viable for all? And that's part of Eric's point. And so to me, that was a huge shift we had to make, that we should stop selecting and sorting kids out and rather help all children over the bar through whatever kinds of programs and things we had to create. And that all came from Rick's leadership during the 90s. And that, of course, is a big part of the PLC work.
And I'll let Troy speak more to this, but what's so interesting about that, to hear you say that 69% of the kids in the late 80s were getting D's or F's in math and science. I mean, that's a stunning number. What's so fascinating about that, though, Tim, is that when you consider now that our DNF rate is probably less than 5% and well over 80% of our grades in A's and B's, you can see what a dramatic turnaround that has been. And, I know there are people out there who would say, well, we can make that happen too. We'll just give away A's and B's like Oprah, you get an A, you get an A, you get an A. But what's fascinating about that is if you were to plot that kind of turnaround, in the A and B and the DNF rates, Troy, if I'm not mistaken, it mirrors the slow but over time increase in our ACT and SAT and AP scores. And, we're not just inflating grades, and sending kids off to college unprepared. I mean, what you're literally seeing is a complete turnaround in, how we're educating kids. And that idea of helping all kids reach mastery or proficiency is what it is about now. So I don't know, Troy, if that is something that you wanted to speak to, but that's what we're most proud of, that we've been able to sustain that, really over the last 20 years.
Yeah, I think it's the combination of what Tim mentioned earlier with the growth in the math ACT score. If your average math ACT score is a 28 and you're still giving 30% of the kids an F or a D, something doesn't make any sense. And so that's really, now, on the other hand, if you're giving 90% of the kids A's and the average ACT score in your school is an 18, you might wonder about that, right? But I think with both sets of data, you can say, I feel good about this. And if things are going well, all kids should meet the standards of the course. That's our commitment to the community when they come here, because most people have moved to Stevenson to go to our school district with the expectation their kids are going to be successful. That's our job to make that happen.
Right.
Well, and Troy, I was just going to say, you're it's not just your book, but I have a picture of you. So I have a slide where I have a picture of you and I have a picture of the book on proficiency.
It's because I'm the good looking one.
That might've been it. I'm not sure.
It's not true at all.
Whatever.
Mark. Yeah, that's mine.
But that idea of talking about grading and how can we actually think through what proficiency looks like in courses and do that really well. I think there are resources for people out here listening to this podcast that, they can find if that's something they really want to work on as they begin to do exactly what the two of you said, which is without lowering the bar. Because if you lower the bar to give those grades out, then that's disingenuous. And if you do that for certain minority groups of students, that's even more disingenuous. Now the bar stays here, but then how do we help? So to me, that book really helps, I think, us think through some of those grading issues and getting consistency there. I know we're dancing around some of the topics here. I will say one thing that I'd like us to talk about for a little bit if we could, and that is, so that happens in the 90s. Eric's now in, he's working hard to make it happen. Rick knows he's going to retire and leave in 2002, in June of 2002, and he's going to do it because he wants to go out and do this work across the nation and really begin to help professional learning communities at work become a national movement like it is today, and in the tens of, hundreds, thousands of schools in which it's part of how they operate. And it just happened. I was the person that, the board selected to be the next superintendent. And I did not really want the job, Eric. I don't know if you wanted it, but I did not really want the job. And I didn't want it partly because I knew I was replacing an icon. And when you replace someone who literally started the whole movement and who is this iconic human being, and you're not, it's kind of like, well, shoot, you can only bring the organization down. So we were talking about this earlier, but it's true. The Chicago Tribune did come out and interview me on July 7th, my 6th day on the job of 2002, and said, well, Dr. Kanold, aren't you only going to bring the organization down? Because no one can kind of be as and direct it all the way Dr. DuFour did. And I think, my response, which might not have been the one they wanted though, but I think it's true about the sustainability aspect of it, was that what I told that reporter was, we just went through a massive evaluation. And at the end of that evaluation, the committee, this task force throughout our district, all community, all the different stakeholders, and because I was becoming the next superintendent, I was responsible for organizing and driving that entire outside evaluation that we had. And at the final meeting, the evaluators in front of everybody on the task force said, well, we need you to know it's awesome here, but there's only one problem. This is what the community is saying they're most worried about. So I'm like, sure, I'll do whatever I can to steward that forward. And they're like, well, they're afraid that because you're becoming the next superintendent, the school district will not embrace the idea of continuous improvement and change the way they did while Dr. DuFour was superintendent. Mm. And I said to them, and so I'm telling the reporter this, and I said, that to me was the best news of all. The fact that our culture is a culture that embraces and wants to pursue continuous improvement and change as a way of thriving in their community life at this place means it's far beyond me. My job now is to make sure it continues to thrive, and I provide this opportunity for them to grow and change. And I said, so I think the evaluators are concerned. I saw it as a criticism. I saw it as a relief, because I knew if we didn't have that mindset, we would not be able to sustain the effort, no matter what I would try to do. And I think to some extent, my job was to provide more of a hand on the rudder now. Not as much of, I didn't have to do some of the heavy lifting we had to do while Rick was in charge. I was able to lead more by facilitating successful opportunities for people to continue to embrace that change. And of course, teach and promote it as well.
To learn more about their strategies and data on becoming a model PLC district, navigate to www.allthingsplc.info. Then at the top, click on See the Evidence and search for Adlai Stevenson High School, where you can also use the filters and look through the options to find a school or district similar to yours. Also, to learn more about our Solution Tree associates, and then also to request their professional development guidance, go to solutiontree.com, search for their name, and on that page, you can make your request. Now, for our sponsor message here from the company. At Solution Tree, we share your vision to transform education to ensure learning for all, and we can help you make this vision a reality. No other professional learning company provides our unique blend of research-based, results-driven services that improve learning outcomes for our students. All right, we appreciate you tuning in. Make sure to navigate to our solutiontree.com/podcast page to listen to our other episodes. There you can subscribe to our podcast today. Just click on the subscribe button, and then you can select your favorite podcast app. Also, remember to like our episodes and subscribe to our YouTube channel. This has been your host, Prisma Lopez-Marin. Thank you for joining us for Charting New Paths in Pre-K-12 Education.